right, so this is our next lesson on the crucifixion. All right, so let's go ahead and start by our W Bible verse. We love, our L, or we do our love sign. We love him because he first loved us. 1 John 4:19. All right, and let's do our song. All right, we only have a couple more times to work on this song to go with these lessons, and then we'll have to come up with a new song for our next set of lessons. All right, but let's do this one. The blind man stood by the road and he cried. The blind man stood by the road and he cried. The blind man stood by the road and he cried, oh, show me the way, show me the truth, show me the life and the way to go home. The lame man stood by the road and he cried. The lame man stood by the road and he cried. The lame man stood by the road and he cried, oh, show me the way, show me the truth, show me the life and the way to go home. Jesus was nailed to the cross and he died. Jesus was nailed to the cross and he died. Jesus was nailed to the cross and he died, and he cried, oh, oh, I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life and the way to go home. The blind man stood by the road and he cried. The blind man stood by the road and he cried. The blind man stood by the road and he cried, oh, I found the way, I found the truth, I found the life and the way to go home. Jesus. All right, because Jesus is the way to go home. All right, so we ended our last lesson with Jesus before the high priest, and the high priest did not want to accept the truth. And then they were going to lead him out into the courtyard and take him over to Pilate, who was over Jerusalem, the governor over Jerusalem, and they had to have the Romans agree that it was okay to crucify Christ. And so that's where they were headed. But when they walked out into the courtyard, now remember, here's Jesus back here. Remember that at the Last Supper, the disciples had said, we will never say anything against you. We will always stand for you. In fact, we would even give our lives for you. And Peter said he would die for Christ. And Christ had to correct him and said, sorry, Peter, but before the cock crows 3 times today, you will deny, before the cock crows today, you will deny me 3 times. Okay, so before the rooster announced the morning, Peter was going to deny Christ 3 times. And so when Jesus came out into the courtyard, here was Peter. He had come in to see what was going on and try to get in, but they wouldn't let him into the courtroom. So he stayed out in the courtyard hoping to get some information on what was going on. And someone looked at him and said, hey, aren't you one of those disciples that's with Jesus? Aren't you one of the men? And he said, no, you think it's me, but no. And then someone else looked at him and said, yes, you are. You're a Galilean. You have to be with that Jesus. Oh no, not me. And as Jesus walked into the courtyard, and the rooster was about to crow, good morning, another person said, yes, he is. I'm sure he's one of those disciples. And Peter said, no, not me. And then he looked up and he saw Jesus standing in the courtyard. Oh, he was so sad because he had denied Jesus. Now he was very much afraid of what might happen to him. They had dragged Jesus off to court. So Peter probably thought he could be dragged off to court too. He might be next. And so he forgot about his love for Jesus. And he said, no, I'm not one of those disciples. But now he was ashamed and very sad. And Jesus would later tell him that he forgave him. But Peter was very sad. So we need to be careful. What comes out of our mouth is always the truth, and that we stand up for Jesus no matter what. Even when it's hard sometimes, we need to do what is right. All right, and so the disciples, or the religious leaders, then took Jesus over to Pilate to have Pilate agree that he should be crucified. And Pilate spoke with Jesus, and Jesus did not act like a traitor. They were saying he was causing riots, and he was unruly, and he was saying things that were not true. But Jesus stood before Pilate very quietly. And when Pilate asked him questions, he didn't have a big, long response. He would just say, you say that I am. Okay? And so his responses were not wild. They were calm. And he didn't try to defend himself. And so Pilate looked at him and he was like, I don't see this man as being who you say he is. I don't think this man has done anything wrong. And the chief priest and his religious rulers were like, yes. And then they told the crowd, yell, crucify him. Yell, crucify him. And the crowd began to yell, crucify him. Crucify him. And Pilate was like, oh my, I don't understand. And so he thought, well, maybe if I have my soldiers, boy, I'm having trouble with those words today. Maybe if I have my soldiers beat him and mock him, and then I bring him back out in front of the crowd with cuts and bruises, maybe they'll have pity on him. And so that's what he did. And he brought Jesus back out into the crowd, and the people, they didn't even acknowledge it. They just yelled, crucify him, crucify him. Remember I said, be careful what the crowd is saying and make sure you're not just saying things you don't really understand. And some of the people in the crowd, they hated Jesus and they wanted him crucified. But many of the people were just being led by the crowd. And they were just hollering what the crowd was saying. And so Pilate's wife came to him and said, I had a dream, and I do not think you should have anything to do with this. I think you should give him back to his people and tell them that you want nothing to do with this. And so Pilate went out, and he did not want the religious rulers and the Jewish people to rise up against the Romans. He wanted them not to get angry with him. So he was trying to figure out how he could handle the situation. And he kept telling them, I don't think this man is who you think he is. This man is a good person. And the people were just getting angry. No, crucify him, crucify him. And so he had an idea. Well, it was custom for the Romans to let one prisoner go at this time of the year. And so he thought, I have a plan. He went to the prison and he brought out a really bad prisoner that had stolen and been mean and had robbed some of the people in the crowd. And he said, who would you have me release unto you at this time? Barabbas, this thief, this criminal that you all know is bad and mean and awful, or this man who doesn't seem to have done anything wrong, this Jesus of Nazareth? Who would you have me release? he thought for sure they would pick Jesus of Nazareth. He hadn't done anything wrong or anything like Barabbas. Barabbas had been evil and mean and had robbed people. And everyone knew that. But Satan was at work, and he worked in the hearts of the high priest, and he worked in the hearts of the people in the crowd. And they yelled, "Crucify him! Crucify him! Jesus of Nazareth, that's who we want you to crucify. Let Barabbas go free." Now Pilate was kind of confused, and so he said, "Fine, I will give him unto you, and you do it. I am washing my hands of this because I do not think he is an evil man." Okay? So the high priest and the religious rulers took Jesus to be crucified on the cross. And Pilate had them write above his name, "The King of the Jews." They were not happy with him for saying that because they didn't want to believe that he was the King of the Jews. They didn't want to believe he was the Messiah. But Pilate made them write it anyway because he realized in his heart that this man was innocent. All right, and so they gave Jesus the cross to carry up the hill, but his body was so weak at this time that he could not. He fell over. And so the guards yelled at a man called Simon of Cyrene, and they said, "You come and you carry this cross up for Jesus." So Simon did. He came and he got a hold of the cross and carried it up the hill. And then Jesus was put on the cross, just like our song says. He was nailed to the cross, and he was going to bear all the sins. And so it was in the morning, and then towards noontime, then Jesus yelled out, "It is finished," meaning all the work of the sin was taken care of. He had borne it all on his shoulders, and he had banished sin for all mankind. All right? Doesn't mean we don't do things that are wrong today. We do. But the consequence of all sins was taken care of. We no longer needed a blood sacrifice to take care of that sin. Jesus had taken care of the consequences. So we still have to ask for forgiveness, and we may have consequences from our parents and from natural consequences, things that happen because we did something wrong, to help us to remember. But the final penalty has been paid. That final penalty that separates us from God, that was paid by Jesus, and he had victory over Satan. Okay? Now Satan thought he had won. But at that moment when Jesus cried, "It is finished," he had actually beaten Satan. Sin was now forgiven. But Satan didn't quite understand that because Jesus had died. Okay? When he yelled, "It is finished," then he looked to his Father in heaven and asked his Father in heaven to remember him. And God turned his face back towards Jesus, and Jesus died. Okay? So after it was finished, God was able to turn his face back towards Jesus, and Jesus died. Now, right before his death, there were two men on the cross, two thieves. One of them made fun of him, said, "If you really are the Son of God, why don't you call down some angels from heaven and have them take you off the cross?" And Jesus could have done that. And if he called to God, "Come take me down from this cross, I am done," then that's what would have happened. But he bore, remember I said he was willing to go to the cross, and he bore that sin because he loved us. First, he loved us so much that he died on the cross for our sins. And so he did not call down angels to rescue him. And the other thief said, "Don't make fun of him. Do you not realize who he is? He is the Son of God." And he looked to Jesus and he said, "Will you remember me today?" And Jesus said, "Today you will be in heaven with me." All right? So even on the cross, he was still doing God's work of preaching the gospel and saving souls, even on the cross. All right, and so he gave up the ghost and he died. Now, because it was the Friday and the next day was the Jewish Sabbath, when they had church, they wanted the people to be down off the cross before the next morning. And so what normally would happen in the evening, the soldiers would go around and break the legs of the prisoners, and then they would die more quickly. But because Jesus had already died, that didn't have to happen. Okay? And that was also mentioned in the prophets of the Old Testament. It had been prophesied that not a bone of his body would be broken. And so he did not need to have his leg broken because he had already died. So he fulfilled that prophecy. All right? Instead, they put a spear in his side, and when water and blood flowed out, they knew that he had died, and so they could take him down off the cross. All right? And also, one more thing that happened after he yelled, "It is finished." See how the dark clouds came? All right? And the earth trembled. And the people began to realize this had been something amazing that had happened, something important, because the earth shook and the sky got really dark. And even the soldier that was watching Jesus believed this must have been the Son of God, because look at the earth shaking and look at the sky getting dark. He must have been who he said he was. So even the soldier believed in him because of all that happened. Sadly, those religious rulers did not. It was very sad for them that they did not believe. But this soldier also believed because of what was happening. All right. So then Joseph of Arimathea asked for the body of Jesus, and he placed him in his family's tomb. Okay? So they did not have tombs like we have today. Instead, there was a cave in the side of the hill that they would dig out, and then there would be this big stone that they would roll over the tomb whenever they needed it, and roll it back if they were going to add somebody. So it was a family tomb. So the whole family would use that to be buried. Well, this man had a tomb close by, and he agreed, or he said, and he went and asked for the body of Jesus so he could lay it in that tomb. And so he wrapped Jesus' body up in linen, which was the custom of when you died, your body was wrapped up. You almost looked like a mummy, wrapped up in linen, and he placed him inside the tomb. Okay? Now, the religious leaders went back to Pilate and said, when they roll this stone away, or they roll the stone in place, you need to have soldiers guard it, because there's this thing that Jesus was saying to his people. In 3 days, he would rise from the dead. Now, we don't believe him. We don't think he really is going to rise from the dead. But what we think might happen, this is the religious rulers, we think his disciples will come and steal his body away from the tomb and then say, "Oh, he's risen from the dead." And we don't want that to happen, because we don't want people to think that happened. And so we set some soldiers in front of the tomb. And so Pilate gave them soldiers to set in front of the tomb, and he told the soldiers, "It's your job to watch this tomb. If somebody steals the body away, you will be in trouble. So watch this tomb." All right? So here's the giant stone that goes in front. So it'd be a big giant stone, weighed a lot of weight. And they would slide it over and then slide it back as they needed. Okay? So these soldiers were in charge of not letting anybody into the tomb and steal the body, because they didn't want it to get out that Jesus might have risen from the dead. All right. So that is the end of that lesson. So remember our Bible verse? We love him because he first loved us, and he showed us how much he loved us by dying on the cross willingly. He took all of our sins upon his shoulders that we might be saved. All right? That we might have life eternally, because now we know the way, the truth, and the life. And who is the way, the truth, and the life? Jesus, right? All right, so next Wednesday, I will put up the continuation, because our story is not over. The religious rulers thought, and Satan thought, he had won. When Jesus was on the cross, Satan thought he had won. He had won the world away from God. But that's not the end of the story. The story does not stop with Christ dying on the cross. And so on Wednesday, we're going to finish that part of the story that shows us that Jesus did not end with dying on the cross. His victory over Satan was going to happen in the next part of our story.